the people in countries which are doing environmental harm themselves on top of the brunt of the imperialism of climate policies are even more affected, considering the international policies are also not in their favor. Promises, promises, and promises. Every single year, we hear countries and organizations making promises about their deep commitment to climate action, and yet somehow we are yet to see sufficient global progress towards such climate action. And how could we, when the countries who are the most affected by climate change are having to pay the highest price? In my speech, I will talk about the Paris Agreement, the Loss and Damage Fund, the position of developing economies in climate negotiations, and finally, climate security, to explain why that is the case. However, before I proceed, I would like to take the time to thank the President for giving me the opportunity to speak at this debate of such great importance tonight. You, the officers, and the entire committee have worked incredibly hard, not just on this debate, but on the entire term card, and it has been an absolute pleasure having you as the President and such a wonderful team during my first term on committee. Now, in order to expand on the argument of the proposition and to address what the opposition mentioned, I must clarify once again what we are arguing for and what neo-imperialism means within the context of this motion. It is important to recognize that there is in fact no single international climate policy. It is also important to recognize that if imperialism, by definition, can be a practice, an attitude, then it does not necessarily have to be direct. Its consequences can be implicit, which the opposition does not seem to acknowledge. We also have to understand, in order to understand the extent of imperialism and the ways in which they leave an impact, we also cannot simply be looking at the policies in and of themselves. We must also look at the processes through which such policies are made and how they work in reality, not just how they sound in theory. Since the opposition mentioned the Paris Agreement, I would like to talk about that for a while. Now, even though theoretically the purpose of the Paris Agreement is to hold countries accountable for their emissions and make sure that they're meeting their targets, the agreement itself has not till date set or suggested a mechanism through which countries can actually meet the targets which are required to cut their emissions. Instead, it relies on nationally determined contributions, which are voluntary targets decided by the countries themselves. And we have seen just during the first ever global stocktake in COP28 that most countries are not up to the mark regarding the target that they themselves have set for themselves, let alone the target that they should be meeting, which the proposition speaker after myself will be expanding on. This is not to suggest that there should be a universal mechanism which applies to everyone in the exact same manner, but that the historic context should be taken into account while deciding on how to proceed with these targets and with reducing emissions. Otherwise, we will continue seeing what we saw in COP28. Now, there actually has been some progress made in the international climate sphere. It would be unfair to deny that that was not the case. For example, in COP28, there has been $700 million donated to the Loss and Damage Climate Fund. But that progress simply is not enough at this stage when we have already received final warnings from scientists that we might soon head to a point of no return if we don't take immediate action. And if we look at the total amount of target for the loss and damage, which is $580 billion, $700 million is merely a drop in the ocean. And furthermore, if we look at some of the top contributions to the Loss and Damages Fund at the COP28, including from the United Kingdom, we will see that much of the amount pledged comes from existing climate finance commitments. So there hasn't actually been much additional amount that the countries have pledged to address climate change other than the finance that they had already set aside for other climate commitments, which means that contribution to this funding will result in funding shortage for other climate commitments. So it appears that these small bouts of progress, some of which the opposition also seems to have mentioned, are used to create the illusion of some great success, so that every time there is criticism of the shortcomings of existing policies or mechanisms, these progress stories can be weaponized to say, at least we are doing something, we are getting there. But by the time which we are supposedly meant to get there, it will be too late, as you got this right, for many countries who are affected the most by climate change, it would have been too late by then. The annual temperature, for example, in Mali has increased by 0.7 degrees Celsius since 1960, a country already covered 2/3 in desert. My country, Bangladesh, is predicted to go 17% underwater by 2050 and displace 20 million people if we don't take climate actions immediately. There's also Afghanistan, Sudan, Congo, Chad, Central African Republic, Eritrea, Guinea, Somalia, Liberia, who are some of the most climate vulnerable countries, and the list goes on. And we simply do not have the luxury of waiting for the proposed climate solutions to, at some point, come into action. Now, the opposition has mentioned that suggesting that climate policies are neo-imperialist takes away or ignores the contribution of developing economies. And I think it is in fact quite important to acknowledge the contributions, the very significant contributions the developing economies have made to international climate policies through their strength and resilience to avoid the passive victim narrative, which is far too often thrown at us. And I agree with the opposition on that much. However, it is important to recognize that it is the very strength and resilience of the global majority in international climate negotiations who have been pushing for bringing changes in policies that we have finally started acknowledging the power imbalances within such mechanisms, and it is finally the time when we have started taking some actions towards addressing these issues, even though they are not enough. So if anything, declined. So if anything, it is because of the people of the global majority that we are now beginning to see why the international climate policies are neo-imperialist. On the other side of things, the opposition might also say today, after I leave, that saying that international climate policy is neo-imperialist, it takes away the culpability of developing economies themselves for the damages they're causing in their own countries and to their own people. But we are not suggesting that developing economies should not have any responsibilities, or that we as human beings, we as societies should not work together to bring substantive change. anything, the people in countries which are doing environmental harm themselves on top of the brunt of the imperialism of climate policies are even more affected, considering the international policies are also not in their favor. The afforestation project in different indigenous lands in Bangladesh, for example, have led to environmental degradation and displacement, even though it seems to be a popular international climate policy. So if anything, this should be all the more reason why people should vote for side proposition of this debate. Now, finally, to reiterate the point of the proposition, to understand the extent of imperialism, we cannot only look at the factors which climate policies do consider, but also the ones that they don't. If we look at the climate security frameworks, they include the impact of climate change on conflicts, but they hardly ever include the impact of conflicts on climate change. The speaker before me mentioned the genocide in Palestine, one where a famine is predicted to affect over 1 million people. There is Sudan, where 5 million people are at risk, which will continue causing environmental degradation for years and years to come, and yet somehow within climate security frameworks, we do not have given the same importance to conflicts which affect the already former colonial territories or the already developing economies, and we have no consideration for how such conflicts is going to continue affecting them for decades and years to come. So if we want to understand the interrelation between imperialism and climate policies, we need to only look at how the same countries who brag about being pioneers of climate security are the same ones who have simultaneously and repeatedly opposed calls for cessation of hostilities in conflict situations, how they are the ones who have simultaneously opposed calls for addressing climate as a higher order factor in situations of conflict. But it does not have to be this way, as the opposition themselves seem to have agreed with, that it is the developing economies who are leading the change, and as the proposition is arguing, that it is the developing economies who have always been vocal about the imperialist nature of climate policies and how they perpetuate power imbalances. So there is still hope for change, but in order for that to happen, we must act now, and we must recognize the power imbalances and the imperialist nature of international climate policies, and we must side with the proposition of this motion tonight. Thank you.